Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Side Hustle Safety Net: How Vulnerable Workers Survive Precarious Times by Alexandrea J. Ravenelle, narrated by Rachel Perry. Publisher's note: this audiobook includes bonus material. Please visit Tantor.com and type Side Hustle Safety Net into the search box. Follow the link to the books page, then, under the supplemental content section, please enter the access code JOBS, and then click the Unlock button to access the bonus material. The code should be entered in all lowercase letters. All figures and tables referenced in this audiobook can be found in the bonus material. 1. Officially unemployed, or forgotten jobless. In early 2020, Abdul, a 27-year-old Middle Eastern American, was working several jobs: restaurant and bar server, videographer, and light catering on the side. But then the coronavirus pandemic hit. Bars were considered non-essential. Restaurants could stay open for takeout, but were prevented from offering on-site dining, rendering their servers redundant. I worked in 2 different places, and they basically fired everyone. They never promised us our jobs back after this was done, he said. They just basically said, "We can't afford to have you guys on the payroll." One place that I worked at, they only kept 2 of the kitchen staff. Only 2. Abdul applied for unemployment assistance, but he'd spent part of the previous year working in Florida and hadn't worked long enough to qualify for New York State unemployment benefits. I was working on tips, so the money that I was making on the books wasn't enough, he said. Even if I did qualify for unemployment, I would have gotten change, literally change. He tried to apply for unemployment assistance from Florida, explaining, "That didn't work either, because they're like, oh, you can't go on to unemployment with Florida if you live in New York. You're not a resident." It's bullshit. Abdul was a member of the forgotten jobless, left outside the unemployment assistance safety net during a generation-defining pandemic. It didn't take long for him to run out of money. In his first interview in May 2020, Abdul described himself as super frustrated, just anxious all the time, and it's not fun. It's a scary fucking situation, he said. Like, you might wake up one day and not have any money for food or hygiene products. I haven't shaved in weeks. I shave my face. I can't even afford to get a razor. Abdul had done side hustle work on food delivery apps before the pandemic, and as his finances deteriorated, he decided to do food delivery work full-time. I had no other choice but to find something, some sort of income, he said. I ran out of money. But Abdul wasn't the only person who viewed side hustle work as an economic safety net, and competition for food delivery work was fierce. On one app, workers had to claim delivery slots in 30-minute increments in advance. Sometimes you go on, and you only see from 11 to 11:30. You can claim that slot, but then the next opening is from 4 to 4:30, from 4:30 to 5, he said. You can spend a whole day trying to work and end up working only 2 hours. Even when you work a few hours, you're not guaranteed deliveries back to back. So you can get a delivery, do the pickup, drop off, and then end up waiting, wasting the rest of that hour, just waiting for another order. With platform-based gig work so unreliable, Abdul also started picking up moving gigs via Craigslist, work that he described as horrible. Instead of being direct hires by the resident, most of the positions were posted by outsourcing middlemen. They claim that they have a crew and a truck, and then they go rent a truck like a U-Haul or something, and then they, again, hire a couple people like myself. They pay us less than what we would make if we were dealing directly with the person that was offering the job, he said. "The pay is horrible. They don't provide any safety equipment. They don't even provide sanitizer. You have to get your own mask. You have to get your own gloves. They have no insurance. So if anything breaks, anything goes wrong, you're responsible for that, you know? So if you work all day and one thing gets broken, it's coming out of all of our money." The first time he had to pay for a moving mistake, one of his fellow workers had thrown a storage ottoman in the moving truck, not realizing that it held picture frames. The frames inside broke, and the replacement cost was split among the 4 workers, $20 each. "The second time was a big statue," Abdul said, noting that a teenage colleague without moving experience had leaned on the statue, breaking it. "It was super expensive. I was supposed to make about $80 plus tips. None of us got paid. That was crazy. Even though it was only a couple of hours, it was just so unfair." But given the choice between working or waiting for work, Abdul thought the off-platform moving gigs were preferable. "Even though it's risky, at least you know that you're going to go do this job for a couple of hours and get that much money," he said, noting that food delivery work with DoorDash and Uber Eats wasn't guaranteed. "It's not steady. It's not a steady income. You can't count on it. If you have to pay a certain amount of money for rent every month, you're never really confident. You're never really sure you're going to be able to make rent. Something like Uber, you're driving, you're using your personal car. If you really think about it, the money that you're making is not enough. You're putting the wear and tear on your car, the tickets, and the parking violations. If you're doing Uber Eats, you have to go in and out of restaurants and buildings. All that stuff costs a lot more than what you're making. So you're basically just trying to make enough money to survive today, and you're basically just fucking over your future self. It's like you're borrowing. You're not earning that money. You're borrowing it from your future self." Abdul tried looking for a stable job, even walking his neighborhood with a handful of resumes. But at numerous businesses, he was told that there were dozens of applications ahead of his. One job he applied for, he didn't hear back for a year. It took that long for the manager to work through all of the other applications. He heard of someone who was helping people to get unemployment assistance in exchange for a cut of their benefits, but he was worried about the legal implications, describing it as pretty sketchy. "I knew that I deserved some kind of unemployment. I paid taxes. I bust my ass, and I work so hard. I had to work really shitty jobs," he said. "I remember when I was a teenager, I was thinking to myself, this is crazy. A third of my paycheck is just disappearing. I'm paying a third of my paycheck as taxes. But then, if I lose my job tomorrow, I don't get any kind of help." And I was thinking about that when I was like 18. More than a year into the pandemic, Abdul had resigned himself to the lack of help. "So I just came to a place in my life. I just accept it now. I accept that the country that I live in, the place that I live in, is a little bit fucked up, and I have to take it for the good and the bad," he said. "If something happens, I just have to work a little bit harder, maybe suffer a little bit more, but I'm going to make it through." Andrew, a 27-year-old white man, was less than a week into his dream job when he was laid off. After more than a year as a Peace Corps volunteer in West Africa, Andrew had spent several months working as an au pair for a local family as he tried to decide what he wanted to do with his life. "It's always been a dream of mine to work in the food industry, and I finally made the decision that I wanted to get professional training working in a restaurant," he said. It took more than a month, but he was eventually able to convince a local high-end restaurant to let him trail, or work shifts in the kitchen as part of an audition process. "I spent 4 days working in the kitchen, and on Friday afternoon, chef came in and said they were closing. But I think the day before I had actually gotten on the books," he said, As crazy as it was, if I hadn't been so aggressive about trying to get this job, I would be in a completely different situation right now. Even though he hadn't been working for at least 90 days, because he was on the books and had lost his job through a corona-related event, he was able to qualify for unemployment assistance. It didn't hurt either that the CEO of the restaurant group that he was working for pledged to pay workers for an additional week after the restaurant closed, and later started an employee relief fund. In his week on the books at the restaurant, he had earned minimum wage for 35 hours, or about $500. When I interviewed him for the first time in early June 2020, Andrew was still receiving partial unemployment of almost $900 a week, had taken a part-time job as a cheesemonger at a local farmer's market, and was helping friends with a small food startup. It's weird. Things work out like this in my life. I don't know. I think people have said it's just the way you see it. If you look at things a certain way, things tend to just kind of flow. Yeah, so actually starting in April, really, I was working probably more, making more money than I would be at the restaurant, and both in food-related jobs, he said. I've been able to establish a little nest egg again, and emergency fund, and actually today I put down a deposit for a new sublet, so I'm going to move next week into my own apartment. I feel kind of safe that I'll definitely be able to pay rent. When I interviewed him again in the spring of 2021, Andrew had recently been hired back by the restaurant for several months, leaving behind the cheesemonger job. The restaurant wasn't fully open, and he was primarily making meals for needy families, but it meant the opportunity to cook, and the job offered benefits. But he was uncertain about when the restaurant would reopen fully, and his friends at the food startup were looking to hire, so he quit the restaurant. They've just been experiencing pretty robust growth, and they were in a position to offer me a full-time role, he said. It's nice to be in a salaried role, actually. I think at the moment of getting this opportunity, it seemed like more of a long-term, stable kind of career trajectory. The focus of this book. Both Andrew and Abdul lost jobs during the coronavirus pandemic. But while Andrew was officially unemployed and qualified for unemployment benefits, including the additional $600 a week of Federal Pandemic Unemployment Compensation, FPUC, Abdul was part of the forgotten jobless. Left to fend for himself, Abdul turned to the side hustle safety net of gig work. While his vow to make it through is admirable, the inequity between their situations is jarring. This is the story of what happens to the most precarious workers, the gig workers and laid-off restaurant staff, the early career creatives, and the minimum wage employees, when the economy suddenly collapses, and how they fare in the long pursuit of an economic recovery. In this book, I ask, how does obtaining the status of being officially unemployed or being part of the forgotten jobless affect workers? How do officially unemployed workers make sense of receiving more on unemployment than they were making while working? For those who kept working, how do they feel about their minimum wage paycheck and increased risk of exposure to the virus compared to peers who were paid to stay home? How do workers reconcile the contradiction between the amount of money spent during COVID and a failure to protect the vulnerable? And finally, how do larger social trends, such as the internalization of risk and the rise of polyemployment, or working 2 or more jobs, affect precarious workers during these unsettled times? The importance of unemployment assistance and polyemployment. Why does it matter if people are officially unemployed and receiving benefits? Anyone who has ever received unemployment will be quick to note that it's typically not very much money, generally enough to cover one's food, transportation, and utilities, but not necessarily rent or a mortgage. Or, if it's enough to cover the rent, it's not also enough to pay for food and other living expenses. Receiving unemployment benefits may keep an unemployed professional from emptying their rainy day fund, but it won't necessarily prevent them from tapping their savings. But unemployment assistance is more than micro-level payments to individuals. Unemployment benefits have a macro benefit as an automatic stabilizer, a mechanism that can help to maintain spending during an economic slowdown. For better or worse, our economy is based on consumer spending. The purchases you make help to keep other people employed. Too many unemployed workers pulling back on their spending can have reverberations throughout the economy, triggering a recession. As Chapter 2 shows, with a brief history of the Great Depression and the creation of state unemployment programs, these stabilizers are an important strategy to ensure that an economic turndown doesn't quickly spiral out of control. If too many workers lose their jobs and don't have access to unemployment benefits, the recessionary impact can be considerable. Much like workers' compensation and Social Security contributions, unemployment insurance is a hard-won protection that has required generations of effort to secure. And just as gig economy companies are effectively rolling back generations of hard-won workplace protections, business strategies that classify workers as independent contractors or pay them in cash under the table also roll back access to the social safety net of unemployment assistance. But it's important to realize that not all of the rolling back of protections is due to company strategies. In recent years, more and more workers have begun engaging in polyemployment. Polyemployment includes having a main job and a side hustle, but it also encompasses working 2 or more part-time jobs. Polyemployment is often a response to underemployment, such as involuntary part-time work, but it's also a response to wage stagnation and can be used to enable the pursuit of passion jobs like creative work. Polyemployment is an example of the internalization of risk, when workers assume personal responsibility for the physical and financial market risks shifted onto them from corporations in a risk society. Facing stagnating wages and the increasing risk of unemployment, workers rely on a side hustle safety net of multiple income sources to create a semblance of job security and income stability for themselves. The goal of the side hustle safety net is to reduce the risk of putting all their eggs in one basket, to quote one respondent. Polyemployment can sometimes help workers when they suddenly discover that one of their previous jobs qualifies them for unemployment. But it can also backfire. State unemployment offices don't generally recognize the financial impact of losing multiple jobs simultaneously, and the presence of a secondary job reduces the amount of unemployment assistance that someone receives. This is the polyemployment paradox, whereby efforts to create income security and a personal safety net can leave workers even more precarious. As Abdul's experience demonstrates, officially unemployed is a status that isn't available to everyone. It's an achieved status, or one that is earned, and that is available only to people who lose their jobs through no fault of their own, through layoffs or company closings, who worked at a job for a sufficient amount of time and who earned above a certain level of income, and who were classified as W-2 employees as opposed to independent contractors. It's limited to people who are actively seeking work and available to take a job if offered. And, historically, this status was an option only for workers in specific approved occupations. As a result, unemployment with a capital U, the status of being officially unemployed, collecting unemployment benefits or being eligible for them, doesn't begin to capture the full range of working and being out of work. A jobless worker might be unemployed, but ineligible for unemployment benefits because the type of job they were working previously, 1099 as opposed to W-2, didn't qualify because they didn't work the previous job long enough, because they weren't paid enough to qualify for benefits, or because they quit instead of being laid off. Or they might simply be the non-working unemployed, like recent graduates, returning homemakers, or people transitioning off disability who don't qualify for unemployment benefits. They may be the partially unemployed, workers who face a reduction in hours or who lost a full-time unemployment qualifying job, but who keep a part-time side hustle that may reduce or disqualify them from unemployment benefits. Or they may be underemployed, working fewer hours than they want at a job, or working at a job that isn't in line with their skills or earning potential. All of these categories signify people who are not making a living wage at a single job and have not recently done so. Some of these individuals are down and out, but some are also making do or getting by, and some are hustling with multiple jobs. Officially unemployed is an achieved status. It feels odd to think about officially unemployed as a status. When we hear the term status, we often think of prestige. The president has more status than their assistant. A doctor is considered to be higher status than a garbage collector. But status is not just about prestige. Status is the position someone occupies in the larger society. And that status sets limits on our behavior and provides access to privileges. A young child is usually free of the responsibility to pay rent, buy groceries, or keep up with car repairs. At the same time, they also don't get to pick their bedtime or eat candy for dinner. Being an adult means getting to pick your own bedtime, a privilege that may be overshadowed by the need to work late to finish a project. Unemployment is typically stigmatized. Unemployed professionals may describe themselves as freelancing, consulting, or being between jobs. All descriptions that suggest an ongoing commitment to work. During the pandemic, that stigma didn't entirely lift, but with so many workers also unemployed, the status of unemployed was less stigmatized. As 35-year-old Ethan, a white, unemployed comedic actor, explained, "I try to remember that it's not like I'm here at my mom's house because I bottomed out and I couldn't get any work anymore and I suck. It's because they shut down the entertainment industry." In The Presentation of Self in Everyday Life, Irving Goffman writes, "Society is organized on the principle that any individual who possesses certain social characteristics has a moral right to expect that others will value and treat him in an appropriate way. Someone who is officially unemployed is generally considered to be deserving of weekly payments from their state government for 26 weeks, or approximately 6 months, and often more during an economic downturn. During the Great Recession, the 99ers were a group of people who received 99 weeks of unemployment assistance, almost 2 years, before they exhausted their benefits. Workers who are officially unemployed are eligible to defer their federal student loans. Officially unemployed workers may be able to more easily qualify for Medicaid or health insurance marketplace subsidies, or hardship repayment programs from their credit cards. During the early months of the pandemic, people with the status of officially unemployed were seen as deserving of financial help that was also intended to keep them and their families safe from the virus. The additional $600 a week FPUC funds were intended to reduce the impact of unemployment on workers, to encourage people to stay home, and to flatten the curve of infection. The forgotten jobless were left to find food delivery jobs in the gig economy or in public-facing essential businesses like grocery stores. The divide between the forgotten jobless and the officially unemployed isn't just limited to the pandemic, though. Increasingly, the status of officially unemployed is unattainable for jobless workers. The W.E. Upjohn Institute for Employment Research notes that the unemployment insurance program has been weakening since the 1980s, serving a smaller percentage of unemployed workers and paying a shrinking percentage of the wages that they have lost. In March 2020, before unemployment claims spiked from the pandemic, the Pew Research Center found that only about 29% of unemployed Americans were considered officially unemployed and receiving benefits. But even that percentage hides the range of recipiency rates between states, or the percentage of unemployed workers who are receiving unemployment assistance. The Upjohn Institute notes that while 9 states have recipiency rates of greater than 40%, 29 have rates of less than 25%. North Carolina's recipiency rate is the lowest in the nation, at 10.5%. As the Pew Research Center notes, there are regional patterns to unemployment assistance. Southern states have generally lower levels of recipiency, while states in the Northeast or Midwest have higher rates. See Figure 1 in the bonus PDF for this audiobook. Even when workers qualify for benefits, there are considerable differences in the maximum weekly benefit amount, with states in the Southeast offering the lowest maximum weekly benefits. It would be easy to say that this is simply a reflection of the cost of living in various states. But it's hard to argue that the cost of living in Kentucky is more than twice as much as Mississippi, or that the cost of living is higher in Texas than California. Daphne Skandalis and her co-authors note that, pre-pandemic, systematically stricter rules in states with a larger Black population contributed to an 8% Black-white gap in the replacement rate. Working outside the social safety net. Unemployment is part of the social safety net. Like a net under a high-wire act, it is supposed to catch you if you fall. But not everyone has access to that net. To paraphrase Abdul from the opening vignette, people without access to the status of officially unemployed get to work a little bit harder at staying on their tightrope, or maybe suffer a little bit more when they fall. In the U.S., most work is at will, meaning you can be fired for any reason at all, as long as it's not an illegal reason, for example, because you're pregnant or for unionizing. But there's a difference between the possibility that you could lose your job and the likelihood that you will. For most professional employees, work on Monday will also mean work on Friday and through the end of the month, and they will stay in that job for the entire year. For precarious workers, work that starts at the beginning of the week might not last through the end of a month, and for gig-based workers, the work may last only a few hours or minutes. Most people have done short-lived forms of work for money at some point. Even tenured college professors occasionally get paid a couple $100 as a speaking honorarium. There's nothing wrong with picking up the occasional gig. But the problem is when one's entire income comes from these gigs. It can be exhilarating to make a living via the hustle of running from one gig to another. There's a sense of working by your wits, of being in demand and choosing your own work adventure. But it can quickly get exhausting, and a tweak in the algorithm can suddenly result in little or no work. Getting sick, having an accident, or simply wanting to take a few days off can also affect how the algorithm treats you. While being in demand and working long hours can generate large paydays, for every big income day, there are likely to be several with less work or little money. Those ebbs and flows in one's income, highlighted in the Chapter 5 discussion of income volatility, affect income dependability and can be stressful. In Precarious Lives, Arnie Kalleberg defines precarious work as including temporary, contract-based work and involuntary part-time work that is often insecure, provides limited economic and social benefits, and is covered by few labor law or regulatory protections. Simply put, precarious work is poorly paid and insecure.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?